Late November 1966. Motown's Studio A Smokey Robinson asked Marvin Gaye to demonstrate perfect vocal control on a single sustained note, expecting a masterclass in technique. What came out of Marvin's throat wasn't mastery. It was a scream held so tightly it sounded like silk. The studio went silent. Smokey Robinson, the man who had written 1,000 love songs, understood in that moment that he had never truly known what control meant. He had been controlling melodies. Marvin was controlling the urge to shatter. This is the story of a challenge that revealed the difference between skill and survival, and how one note showed two men that perfection and desperation can sound exactly the same. Before we explore this forgotten moment in Motown history, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the untold stories behind the voices that shape the music we love. To understand what happened in Studio A that night, you need to understand who Smokey Robinson was in 1966. He wasn't just a singer, he was Motown's sonic architect, the man Berry Gordy called the best writer this company has. Smokey understood vocal technique the way a watchmaker understands gears. He could dissect a melody, explain why certain intervals created certain emotions, describe the physics of vibrato and the psychology of phrasing. When Smokey spoke about singing, even the most experienced vocalists listened. He had that kind of authority. Marvin Gaye, by contrast, was still finding his voice in 1966. He had hits, yes. He was successful, yes. But there was an insecurity that followed him everywhere. He would listen to his own recordings and hear only flaws. He would watch other Motown artists perform and feel inadequate. The smooth, romantic image that the label had built around him felt like a costume he couldn't remove. And underneath that costume was a man drowning in self-doubt, raised by a father who told him he would never be good enough, married to a woman old enough to be his mother, trying desperately to prove something he could never quite articulate. The session that night wasn't supposed to be about competition. Smokey had been working on a new song, something delicate that required a specific kind of vocal restraint. He was in Studio A late, after hours, refining the arrangement when Marvin wandered in. Marvin often did this. He would walk the halls of Motown's Hitsville building at night when everyone else had gone home, sitting in empty studios, touching piano keys, looking for something he couldn't name. Smokey greeted him warmly. They were friends, or as close to friends as anyone could be, in an environment where success was measured in chart positions and everyone was competing for Berry Gordy's attention. They talked for a while, casual conversation about nothing important, and then Smokey played him the track he was working on. The song required a sustained note at the bridge, held for what felt like forever, with no vibrato, no embellishment, just pure control. Smokey demonstrated it, his voice steady and perfect. A textbook example of technical mastery. "That's the hardest part," Smokey said. "Holding a note that long without letting any emotion leak in. Pure control, just air and pitch, nothing else." Marvin nodded, listening. And then Smokey, perhaps sensing Marvin's restlessness, perhaps just making conversation, said something he would think about for the rest of his life. "You should try it. Let's see if you can hold it without breaking." It wasn't meant as a challenge. Smokey's tone was casual, even encouraging. But Marvin heard it differently. He heard every doubt his father had ever planted in his mind, every comparison to other singers, every whispered conversation about whether he was really as good as Diana Ross, or Stevie Wonder, or The Temptations. And something in him needed to prove, not to Smokey, but to himself, that he could do this. Marvin stepped into the vocal booth, and the space suddenly felt smaller, more confined. The padded walls, designed to absorb sound, seemed to absorb light too. The engineer, who had been half asleep at the console, straightened up, sensing that something was about to happen, though he couldn't have said what. Smokey cued the track. In the seconds before the music started, Marvin stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only he could see. The track began, a simple bed of strings and bass, building toward the moment where the voice would need to enter and sustain. When the moment came, Marvin opened his mouth and held the note. What happened next is difficult to describe if you weren't there. The note itself was technically perfect, The pitch was exact, laser-focused on the center of the frequency. The duration was longer than Smokey's demonstration, stretching past 20 seconds without any sign of breath depletion. There was no vibrato, no wavering, no decorative flourishes, no breath sounds audible through the microphone. On paper, analyzed by any vocal coach in the world, it was flawless. But something about it made the air in the studio feel heavy, compressed, as if the room itself was struggling to breathe. Smokey, standing at the console, felt his spine go cold. It started at the base of his neck and traveled downward, vertebra by vertebra, until his entire back was rigid. The engineer, who had heard thousands of vocal takes in that room, who had worked with Diana Ross and Stevie Wonder and every major Motown artist, stopped adjusting levels mid-movement and just stared at the speakers, his hand frozen on the fader. Because what they were hearing wasn't just a held note. It was control so extreme it sounded violent. It was a sound that made you understand, on some instinctual level, that you were listening to someone holding something back. Something enormous. Something that wanted desperately to break free. Something that would destroy everything if it ever escaped. And Smokey, in that moment, understood what he was really hearing. This wasn't vocal technique. This was survival mechanism. Marvin had learned somewhere in his childhood, somewhere in the house with his father's belt and his mother's silence, that if he could control his voice, if he could make it do exactly what he wanted, if he could compress every scream and sob and rage into something contained and performable, then maybe he could survive. The note wasn't music. It was proof that he could hold the chaos inside without letting it show. The note went on. 10 seconds, 15, 20. And in that sustained sound, Smokey Robinson heard something he had never heard before. He heard the effort it took for Marvin to keep his voice from cracking, not because of technical limitation, but because of emotional pressure. He heard a man strangling a scream and making it sound like music. When Marvin finally released the note and the sound died away, the silence in the studio was absolute. Not the comfortable silence of a finished take, but something heavier, darker, like the silence after an accident. The engineer didn't move, his hands still frozen on the console. Smokey didn't speak, couldn't speak, his mouth slightly open as if he had been about to say something and forgotten the words. The tape was still rolling, recording nothing but the hum of equipment and the sound of three men breathing. Marvin stood in the vocal booth, his hands shaking slightly, visible even through the glass, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths, as if he had just surfaced from underwater. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, Marvin opened his eyes and looked through the glass at Smokey. And in that look, there was a question. Did I do it right? Was it good enough? Will you finally tell me I'm not worthless? Smokey, for one of the rare times in his life, didn't know what to say, because he understood in that moment that he and Marvin had been singing about completely different things for their entire careers. Smokey had been singing about love and loss and romance as concepts, as stories, as crafted narratives. Marvin had been singing as an act of survival. That was, Smokey started, then stopped. What could he say? It was perfect. It was terrifying. It was the sound of a man using his voice to keep himself from falling apart. Marvin stepped out of the booth, his expression neutral, waiting for judgment. And Smokey, looking at him, made a decision not to tell him what he had really heard. Instead, he said, "That was controlled. Really controlled." Marvin nodded, something almost like relief crossing his face. He had passed the test. He had proven he could do it. And he left the studio without understanding that Smokey hadn't been testing his ability. He had accidentally revealed the mechanism by which Marvin stayed alive. After Marvin left, Smokey sat alone in the studio for a long time. He rewound the tape and listened to Marvin's note again. And again. And each time, he heard it more clearly. The way Marvin's control wasn't about technique, it was about necessity. The way his voice didn't express emotion, it contained it, held it down, compressed it until it was small enough to live with. Smokey thought about his own singing, his own songs, and for the first time in his career, he felt like a craftsman looking at a wound, and realizing he had been making decorative stitches while someone else was performing surgery on themselves. In the weeks that followed, Smokey found himself thinking about that session constantly. He would be writing a song and pause, wondering if he had ever truly felt what he was writing about. He would hear Marvin's records on the radio and listen differently, hearing all the places where Marvin's voice almost broke but didn't, where the control slipped for just a fraction of a second and you could hear the pain underneath. He never told anyone about that night, not because it was a secret, but because he didn't know how to explain what had happened. How do you tell people that you heard someone sing a single note and it changed your understanding of what music was for? Marvin, for his part, never mentioned the session to Smokey again. In his mind, it had been a small moment, a late-night test he had passed. He didn't know that Smokey had heard something he wasn't trying to show. He didn't know that his control, the thing he was so proud of, was exactly what made Smokey understand how much pain he was in. Years later, after Marvin had recorded What's Going On, after he had stopped trying to be the smooth romantic Motown wanted and had started making music that sounded like bleeding, Smokey would think back to that night in Studio A and understand that he had been given a warning. Marvin's control wasn't going to last forever. Something that compressed, that tightly wound, that violently restrained, eventually had to break. Not because the technique would fail, but because the human being underneath couldn't sustain that level of containment indefinitely. When Smokey listened to What's Going On for the first time, sitting alone in his living room with the vinyl spinning on his turntable, he heard echoes of that sustained note from 1966. The same control was there. You could hear it in the way Marvin shaped every phrase, in the precision of his phrasing. But now there were cracks in it, places where Marvin's voice wavered, where emotion leaked through like water through a failing dam, where the mechanism that had kept everything contained was starting to fail. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough that you could hear what had been hidden all those years. And Smokey knew, listening, that this was both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful because Marvin was finally letting people hear what he had been holding back, because the music was more honest than anything Motown had ever released. Dangerous because once that control broke completely, once the mechanism failed entirely, there might be nothing left to hold him together. The control wasn't just vocal technique, it was the architecture of Marvin's entire identity. They saw each other occasionally over the years, at Motown events, backstage at concerts, always friendly but never quite close. And Smokey wondered sometimes if Marvin remembered that night, if he knew what he had revealed. But he never asked. Some things are too fragile to examine directly. In 1984, when the news came that Marvin Gaye had been shot by his father, Smokey Robinson was in a hotel room in New York. He heard it on the radio and sat down on the edge of the bed, unable to move. And in his mind, unbidden, he heard that note again. That perfect, controlled, suffocating note from 1966, and he understood that he had been listening to a slow goodbye all along. Marvin had spent his entire career holding that note, keeping everything compressed, maintaining control even as the pressure increased. And finally, on April 1st, 1984, the control failed. Not gradually, not musically, but violently and irrevocably. Smokey went to the funeral, stood in the back, and listened to people talk about Marvin's genius, his voice, his contribution to music. And all he could think about was a late night in Studio A casual challenge, and the moment he realized that the most controlled vocalist he had ever heard was also the most desperate. There's a recording of that session somewhere in Motown's archives. Just Marvin holding a single note for 20 seconds. Technically perfect, emotionally unbearable. Smokey Robinson has never tried to find it. He doesn't need to. He can still hear it exactly as it sounded that night, and he knows now what he didn't know then. Control and collapse aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing happening in slow motion. Sometimes the most perfect note is also a scream. Sometimes winning a challenge means losing something you can't get back. Marvin proved he could control his voice. But what Smokey heard in that booth was a man who had been controlling himself for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to let go. And once you hear that, once you understand what control really costs, you can never listen to music the same way again. This is the story of Marvin Gaye and Smokey Robinson, a challenge that revealed more than either man intended, a note that sounded like perfection but felt like drowning, and the silence that followed, which was louder than any sound.